If there was a drinking game for the number of times that we've heard the words troubled waters and Byju's together, well, we'd all be drunk out of our minds by now. The company, once valued at $22 billion, is undergoing insolvency proceedings initiated by the National Company Law Tribunal or NCLT. This is over a $19 million payment default to the BCCI or Board of Control for Cricket in India. Byju's could now see a potential buyout or even liquidation. And it gets worse. A couple of days ago, the Qatar Investment Authority, one of the largest foreign investors in India, requested the Karnataka High Court to block founder Byju Raveendran's personal assets. To say things are bad is an understatement. The obvious question that comes to mind then, of course, is what happened? But that is a story that has been told too many times. Instead, today I'm going to tell you what Olina Banerji, our edtech expert and the writer of our popular newsletter edtech, wrote about Byju's in the latest edition. She took us back to see what made Byju's the company that it became in the first place, and also the legacy that it is leaving behind. Welcome to Daybreak, a business podcast from the Ken. I'm your host Nigdha Sharma, and I don't chase the news cycle. Instead, every day of the week, my colleague Rahil Philippos and I will come to you with one business story that is worth understanding and worth your time. Today is Thursday, the 25th of July. It is 2005. You're visiting your hometown and a friend asks you to help them with their cat entrance exam. The MBA bug never really bit you, but you're confident that you can crack the cat. You do, allegedly, and multiple times, scoring in the top percentiles. Your friends are impressed, and they tell their friends tell their other friends, and soon you're teaching people in an auditorium and then a stadium. Where do you go from here? If you are Raveendran, you choose the path least taken. Between 2005 and 2009, the Byju's lore had grown so much so quickly that the company began to record and sell video lectures to those who could not attend the sessions in person. But why was Byju's so popular with CAT and UPSC students? It was the power of the hack. In a long and rather candid YouTube conversation, Arjun Mohan told another entrepreneur that the company's core team of teachers were focused exclusively on how to crack the exam. It was an ability to work backwards from the answer and use a bunch of shortcuts to get the highest score possible. Mohan was Byju's most recent India CEO, but he's been a part of the company since its inception. And he formed the first coterie of leaders at Think and Learn Private Limited, the parent firm of Byju's. He did leave for a bit in between for a stint as Upgrad CEO. So the hack method is something that Byju's applied to its kindergarten to 12 school material as well. Byju's wasn't the first or last education company to teach to the test, but they were the first to use digital means to scale up. Mohan recalled how the initial team that did the recordings would often work weekends to get the content up and running. In the YouTube interview, he said, and I'm quoting, "We recorded 110 hours of content in 2 weeks." End quote. But why is Olina bringing all of this up? Because she says hacking through an exam became a metaphor for how Byju's wanted to hack growth from the very beginning. The initial focus, which went into building a superior product, shifted quickly to scaling. Had Raveendran never met his first few investors, Ranjan Pai from Manipal Group and Aaron Capital, could this story have looked different? Raveendran has been known to give his edtech contemporaries the same advice at conferences. Scale as fast as possible, the rest will sort itself out. Stay tuned for more on the start of Byju's famous, or rather infamous, sales culture. During the interview, Mohan was pushed, albeit gently, on the sales culture that spawned from the aggressive growth targets. He was quick to say that he wasn't there when the alleged fraudulent loan practices were afoot and that there may have been a few cases. Baiju's representatives have also maintained the few bad apples line despite overwhelming evidence to support the contrary. What Mohan does lay out in the interview plainly is the plan to target their consumers. No one knew what edtech or online education was when Baiju started selling its kindergarten to class 12 product. The sales team could not provide a visual cue over the phone. So, Baiju sent its agents into the field. They would knock on doors, counsel parents about the gaps in the Indian education system, and offer Baijus as the plug that would fix the hole in their child's conceptual understanding. The demo was home delivered, and the consumer just had to sit back and watch. There are two things that Baijus did here to boost its sales. One, Mohan said, it created a one of a kind loan product with Bajaj to trigger an EMI plan for parents who could not afford to pay it all upfront. This insight came from parents when they asked the Baiju sales staff if they could pay per semester like they did with school fees. Now, we all know how this developed into a massive loan crisis for Baiju's, but at its inception, the plan helped to sell the product faster. The second and the deeper insight, according to Olina, was how Baiju's used TV ads to sell an online product. Mohan said it felt counterintuitive at the time to spend big money to book Shah Rukh Khan for a TV spot. But Raveendran was convinced that it would work. The idea went something like this: families gather in front of their TVs in the evenings to watch a soap or the news. It is the 1 hour in the day that the kid has access to a parent's phone. We're talking about 2015, so phones and data were not as ubiquitous. When the Byju's ad pops up, the kid is going to Google the name and sign up. The appeal would lie in the message mouthed by the superstar about falling in love with learning. Kids would recognize that this style of learning, online on a tablet, was more in tune with their generation. With one ad, Byju's was going for brand recall with the parent and lead generation with kids. We can argue about the ethics of selling educational content like you would shampoo, but there is something to be said about the marketing and sales juggernaut that Byju's built in the early years, which later contributed to the internal combustion of the company. In the interview, Mohan skirted the question about the toxic sales culture at Byju's. But he did venture this. The pressure to sell was directly proportional to the pressure to grow. He said, and I'm quoting, I estimated there were 5 to 7 million students we could sell to out of the 260 million school going kids in India. Beyond the first 5 million, students do not pay or pay very little for education. End quote. Raveendran and his team knew this. So, pushing an expensive product to people who could not afford it meant the sales team had to push the loans too. Mohan said that if Byju's had done a physics wala and created a cheaper product or followed Unacademy's path of course-wise subscriptions, things would have looked different. What's puzzling about all of this is the question of who was Raveendran listening to as he set himself and the company on this aggressive growth path. Didn't his investors see this cliff coming? Didn't his staff? Of course, that begs the question, was Byju's even listening? Stay tuned for more on this. In Mohan's estimation, Raveendran is a visionary. He's an inspiring leader and a manager who gave his team the freedom to experiment with new ideas. But what Mohan said about his former boss at the beginning of the YouTube interview does not square neatly with the rest of his testimony, indicating that there wasn't that much room to disagree with Raveendran. Mohan said, and I'm quoting, Byju's board was family members and a few investors. End quote. Raveendran drove the company into multiple acquisitions in pursuit of unbridled growth. Mohan talked about how there was no conversation about the potential revenue, potential cash flow, there was no control on cost. But he also suggested that all tech companies were doing this. Byju's just did it at a much larger scale. If Mohan was the operational head of the business, Raveendran maintained full control over its financials. And we all know how that went. The top down way of taking decisions also impacted the bench strength in the company's top ranks. There were just not enough leaders to run operations across 21 countries. At one point, Mohan said he was running 6 major subsidiaries as the CEO, which included the heavyweight acquisitions of Akash and Great Learning. Running such a scaled up operation needed several leaders with the requisite business expertise, and Byju's hadn't really paid attention to anything but growth. The moves to grow were made with exuberance and optimism, but not a lot of deep business insights. The subtext of Mohan's comments is that Raveendran was too preoccupied with growth and no one told him to take a step back until it was too late. Now, Mohan is clear that this growth obsession was not Byju's alone. Almost every edtech company fell prey to it. There is an argument to be made here that the same investors, fueled by competition and FOMO, drove up the stakes for all the edtechs in play. Potentially, Raveendran got stuck between playing visionary and an operator. On one end, the VCs pumped up his visionary credentials by putting him on a pedestal, but on the other end, he had not created enough leadership or bandwidth for his company to meet his vision. It is too premature to say whether the company will survive, and if it does, in what form. Beyond the BCCI, there are other creditors who need to be paid. Like Olina says, Raveendran has fallen a long distance off the pedestal, and the path to redemption seems hard.
Daybreak is produced from the newsroom of The Ken, India's first subscriber-focused business news platform. What you're listening to is just a small sample of our subscriber-only offerings. A full subscription unlocks daily long-form feature stories, newsletters, and podcast extras. To subscribe, head to theken.com and click on the red subscribe button on top of the Ken website. Today's episode was hosted by Snigdha Sharma and edited by Rajiv CM.